I believed in God, sure, but I also had my share of doubts and a tendency to get lost in everyday struggles. Bills, work, the news blaring with trouble after trouble. Life had a way of pulling my attention down instead of up. Still, I held on to a quiet respect for the sacred. And like so many others, I'd always dreamed of standing inside the great cathedral of Notre Dame one day. When I first saw that building years ago before the fire, I remember being struck by how solid it looked, like it had been standing since the beginning of time and would keep standing until the end. But after the flames nearly destroyed it, something inside me felt like the world itself had cracked. If even Notre Dame could burn, what else could fall apart? So when word began spreading that something strange had happened there in December of 2024, I did not know what to think. Folks talked about a light, an apparition, healings that doctors could not explain. My first instinct was to roll my eyes. Miracles. In Paris. In this day and age, it sounded like wishful thinking, the sort of stories people cling to when the world feels too heavy. But then I began to hear more. Not just whispers on the news, but testimonies from real people. Families, priests, even children saying they had seen something beyond human explanation. And what got me was not the words, but the way they said them. There was no sales pitch in their voices, no showmanship, just awe, just peace. That got me listening closer. I remember sitting in my kitchen one evening, scrolling through my phone, when I saw a video clip that had gone viral. It showed a boy, maybe 12 years old, talking to a reporter with the most honest eyes I had ever seen. His name was Thomas. He said his grandmother had brought him to the cathedral that night, and in that holy place, he felt his grandpa, who had passed away, was happy in heaven. And the way that boy said it, plain, innocent, almost casual, it felt truer than 1,000 sermons. I could not shake it. Something was happening in Paris, something that was not just a headline. It was as if heaven had cracked open for 7 short minutes, and those who were present had walked straight into its glow. At first I told myself, well, even if it is just imagination, maybe it is harmless. Maybe people just need a little hope. But then reports started coming in about healings, not vague feelings, but real documented recoveries. A woman whose hands had been gnarled with arthritis could suddenly move them freely again. A man who had been given weeks to live because of cancer was now baffling every physician with renewed strength. Stories kept piling up, each one harder to dismiss. And it was not just physical healings. Folks said addictions lifted overnight. Marriages that were hanging by a thread found themselves tied back together. People estranged for decades were hugging again, tears streaming down their faces. It was like the city of Paris itself had been washed in a kind of peace that spread out like ripples on a pond, touching lives far beyond France. I know because I felt it too. Even sitting at home in America, I found myself strangely moved. I would watch clips of the crowds gathering outside Notre Dame, candles in hand, voices rising in prayer, and I could feel something stirring in my chest. I had never been a man to cry easily, but more than once I felt my eyes sting, as if something inside me was breaking open. Now, I do not say this lightly. I am a practical man. I've worked with my hands. I've seen enough of life's troubles not to get swept up in fairy tales. But what I was seeing unfold in Paris was not make-believe. It was not hype. It was too steady, too consistent, too full of humility to be explained away as some passing frenzy. And so, little by little, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, something real had happened at Notre Dame that December night. Something bigger than fire, bigger than the stones and glass of that old cathedral. Something that could reach even a man like me, sitting half a world away, wondering what it all might mean. I did not know then that this story would change me, and maybe the whole world, in ways I never expected. After that first week of hearing about Paris, I thought maybe the talk would fade. News moves fast, and usually people's attention shifts before you even finish your morning coffee. But this was different. Instead of fading, the stories grew louder, clearer, more personal. One that really hit me was about a young woman in Chicago. She had battled addiction for years, the kind that eats a person alive little by little until there is nothing left but the craving. She had tried rehab, counseling, and every program under the sun, but the hunger always came back. Then she traveled to Notre Dame, stood in the place where people said Mary had appeared, and prayed. And right there, in that moment, she said the craving was gone, just gone. And what amazed me most was her testimony afterward. She did not just say she felt better for a day or two, she said the need never returned. That kind of story is not the sort you can explain away with a shrug. Addiction is a chain that takes years, sometimes decades, to loosen. Yet for her, it fell away in an instant, and she was not alone. Every account had its own details, but when you boiled them down, they all carried the same refrain. She touched me, she healed me, she gave me peace. It did not stop with believers either. Folks who had not set foot in a church for years, people who considered themselves skeptics, even those who called themselves atheists. They were being moved. In Paris, sociologists began studying the ripple effect. They noted a measurable drop in violent crime. They tracked a sudden surge in charitable giving. Families long torn apart were reconciling. A man who had not spoken to his brother in 2 decades came home from Paris and embraced him with tears. Couples ready to sign divorce papers were instead sitting at their kitchen tables, speaking tenderly to one another again. Some experts tried to explain it away. They called it psychological contagion, as if kindness and healing were just another kind of virus. Maybe that is how academics sleep at night, by putting names on things that cannot be controlled. But the people living it insisted otherwise. This was not just mass emotion, this was transformation. One woman who stuck out to me was Sister Marie-Françoise. She had lived with crippled hands for years, her fingers stiff and twisted. But after that night, her hands were whole again. Instead of retreating into private gratitude, she went the other way. She organized prayer vigils inside Notre Dame. Every evening, hundreds of women, nuns and layfolk alike, gathered to keep watch. They called themselves the Watch of Mary. Picture this: candles burning without end, women chanting the Ave Maria late into the night, their voices bouncing off those ancient Gothic arches. Pilgrims would enter, hear the echo of those chants, and begin weeping without knowing why. It was like the sound itself carried healing. And then there was young Thomas, that boy whose innocent words had been carried across the world. He had told a reporter that his grandmother said Grandpa was happy in heaven, and somehow that simple sentence cut deeper than the longest sermon. Children everywhere seemed to recognize in him a purity that grown-ups had long forgotten. Overnight, he became a symbol. Not because he tried to, but because innocence always shines brightest when the world is dark. Letters began arriving at his grandmother's house by the thousands. School children in Mexico sent drawings. Soldiers in Poland wrote prayers. Cancer patients in California mailed messages of hope. Each note seemed to say the same thing in different words. Through your eyes, we believe. By New Year's, Notre Dame was being called the New Lourdes. The French government, overwhelmed by the floods of visitors, had to put systems in place to keep the pilgrims safe. Yet even police officers on duty admitted the atmosphere was unlike anything they had ever seen. One officer even confessed to a reporter, "I do not believe in God, but every night I leave this place with peace in my chest. Tell me how to explain that." And I think that was the point. Some things you cannot explain with charts or clever phrases. Some things you can only experience. On January 1st, as fireworks marked the new year across the world, Pope Francis addressed humanity from Rome. His words were broadcast live everywhere. Mary, The Mother of God has visited her children in Paris. Her message is not for France alone, but for all humanity. Do not fear, you are not abandoned. Love triumphs over despair. I remember watching it on television, his voice steady yet full of feeling. At that very moment, bells rang out from churches on every continent, ringing in unison, echoing across cities and villages alike. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt united, not by politics or sports or tragedy, but by hope. Some secular commentators tried to spin it as nostalgia, saying people just longed for meaning in chaotic times. Maybe there was some truth to that. But to me and to millions of others, no tidy theory could shrink the flood of peace people carried home. Even Paris itself changed. Cafes once filled with sharp-tongued debates now hosted quiet conversations about grace. Artists filled canvases with their visions of the apparition. Musicians composed new hymns. Even skeptics softened, if not converted. Notre Dame, once scarred by fire, had become more than stone and glass. It had become a lighthouse, not of architecture, but of love, a mother's love, offered freely to anyone who wanted it. And the wildest part? The apparition lasted only 7 minutes, just 7 minutes, yet its waves were stretching into weeks, months, nations, and lives too many to count. As the weeks passed, the weight of it all only grew heavier. You could feel that something big was coming. The crowds in Paris never thinned. Instead, they swelled. Pilgrims poured in from every corner of the globe, and the air carried this strange mixture of awe and expectation. Folks were asking the same question in every language. Would the church, usually so cautious and slow to declare anything supernatural, finally recognize what had happened? By early January, all eyes turned toward Rome. On the 8th day of the new year, St. Peter's Square, filled like a river, had spilled over its banks. More than 150,000 people packed into the square, their eyes fixed on the great balcony of the basilica. Millions more tuned in through television screens and live streams across the world. You could almost feel the electricity in the air, a tight rope stretched between hope and doubt. The bells of St. Peter's began to toll, and at last, Pope Francis stepped out onto the loggia. His voice, though lined with age, carried a warmth that spread even to those sitting in their living rooms half a world away. Brothers and sisters of the world, he began, the Church has examined with the utmost care the events that unfolded at Notre Dame de Paris on December the 13th. After hearing witnesses, reviewing medical evidence, and discerning prayerfully, I now declare the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Notre Dame is recognized as authentic. The square exploded. People shouted, wept, and embraced strangers as if they were lifelong friends. Bells pealed across Rome, and on every continent, from Manila to Mexico City, churches rang their towers in celebration. In Paris, crowds outside Notre Dame collapsed to their knees. Many sobbed openly, not because they needed proof, but because heaven itself had just stamped its seal on what their hearts already knew. The Pope continued, steady and certain. Mary came not to frighten, but to comfort. She came to remind us that God has not abandoned his children, even in an age of doubt. She calls us back to her Son, to love, to mercy, to hope. Her message is simple. Do not be afraid. I am with you. Inside Notre Dame that same day, Marie Claire sat beside her grandson Thomas in the front pew, hands folded tightly. When the Pope's announcement echoed through the speakers, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for letting me see this." Her heart, once heavy with grief, now throbbed with a joy she had not felt in years. Jean-Luc and his wife Claire sat a few pews away. His rough carpenter's hands squeezed hers as tears rolled down his cheeks. Claire, once told she had only weeks to live, now glowed with a health that baffled every doctor she saw. "She gave you back to me," Jean-Luc whispered, voice cracking. For him, the work of rebuilding the cathedral would never again be just a job. It had become devotion, a way to repay grace with the strength of his own two hands. Sister Marie-Françoise stood with her arms raised high, her once stiff fingers moving freely. No longer bound by pain, she had taken up the task of leading a prayer community within the cathedral, drawing women from across the globe. "She gave me back my hands," she told the gathered faithful, "so that I might serve you better." Her testimony lit a fire in countless others, convincing them that their suffering too could be turned into a place where grace might yet arrive. And little Thomas, the boy who once sulked at the thought of going to Mass, had become an unlikely messenger. When a journalist asked him what the Virgin had said to him, his answer was so simple it cut to the bone. She did not speak with words. She spoke with her heart. She told me that God loves us, even if we do not love him back, and that we should love each other the same way. Those words, spoken in the plain honesty of a child, reached deeper than any polished sermon ever could. That moment marked a turning point. The story of Notre Dame was no longer just a tale whispered by pilgrims. It had been confirmed by the Church, stamped into history, and sealed into the hearts of millions. What began as a 7-minute vision now stood recognized as a miracle for the world. After the Pope's declaration, it was as if the floodgates had opened. By the spring of 2025, more than 200 healings had already been verified by medical boards. And I do not mean rumors or whispers, I mean doctors. The same ones who once shook their heads and gave grim diagnoses, now standing there stunned with no explanations left to give. Crime rates in Paris dropped in ways that baffled police chiefs. Donations to charities shot through the roof, and seminaries that had been nearly empty suddenly had young men lining up at their doors. People who once laughed at religion found themselves lighting candles in quiet chapels. Even skeptics admitted something in the air had shifted. You could feel it walking through the streets. Notre Dame itself, still scarred from the Great Fire, seemed to carry a new life. It was not just a monument anymore, it had become a living shrine. Pilgrims streamed in from every corner of the world, men, women, children, old folks, many limping on crutches, others pushing loved ones in wheelchairs. Some came desperate for miracles, others came simply chasing peace. And in one way or another, nearly everyone found what they were looking for. The Church gave the apparition a name, Our Lady of Hope at Notre Dame. Statues were carved, prayers were written, feast days proposed. But in truth, the official titles and ceremonies only brushed the surface. What people remembered most was not the grand announcements, but the memory of her gaze. A mother's tender eyes, the kind that reached into your very soul without a single word. And it spread. My goodness, did it spread. In a world weighed down by war, cynicism, and despair, this message of love moved like wildfire. Families that had been broken apart by bitterness found their way back together. People who had sworn off church for decades suddenly stepped back through the doors, sometimes trembling, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing in disbelief at their own return. Even outside the Christian faith, folks admitted they felt something stirring deep inside, something higher than themselves calling them to kindness, to mercy, to hope. I met a man from Japan who had never set foot in a church in his life, yet he told me he lit a candle at Notre Dame and walked away with a peace he could not explain. It was like, he said, struggling for the words, someone cared for me, someone I could not see. The apparition lasted just 7 minutes, but its echo stretched into months, then into nations, then into countless lives. And here is the truth. The world had only just begun to realize how far-reaching it would all become. Walking through Paris after the apparition was like stepping into a city you thought you knew, but discovering it had been painted in an entirely new light. Cafes that used to buzz with cynicism and gossip now hummed with conversations about grace, hope, and small miracles. Artists filled galleries with paintings of Mary's apparition. Musicians composed hymns, not for church services alone, but for anyone who needed a moment of quiet reflection. Notre Dame, once just a building on an island in the Seine, had become a lighthouse in a fractured world. Its Gothic arches and burned walls no longer seemed like reminders of loss or fire. Instead, they glowed with something almost impossible to describe, a sense that love, real and tender, had passed through this place and lingered. People often spoke of it as if the cathedral itself were breathing. Even skeptics softened. I remember overhearing a man mutter to his friend while leaving the cathedral, "I still don't believe, not really, but I feel lighter." And that, in my mind, was as miraculous as any healing. Because belief is one thing, but the feeling of peace, that quiet calm that settles into your chest, that is something you can't fake. The pilgrims kept coming. Some traveled from the farthest corners of the globe, carrying crutches, wheelchairs, or the weight of grief and worry. Many arrived just in time to kneel where Mary had appeared. Others came to light candles, to leave letters, drawings, or small offerings as tokens of hope. And the energy in the cathedral was palpable, a living, breathing rhythm of devotion. Sister Marie-Françoise continued to lead nightly prayers, her hands healed and tireless. Women from all over joined her, forming what they called the Watch of Mary. Candles burned endlessly, and the chants of Ave Maria echoed against the stone for hours, long past midnight. You could hear pilgrims weeping simply from the sound, not knowing why, just feeling something deep within them shift. And then there was Thomas. That boy, only 12 years old, whose innocent words, "Grandpa is happy in heaven," had spread across the world. Children everywhere recognized the purity in his voice, the honesty and simplicity adults often lost. Letters and drawings poured into his grandmother's house from Mexico, Poland, California, and beyond. Prayers from soldiers, messages from cancer patients, and notes of hope from schoolchildren filled the mailbox, each one echoing the same sentiment: "Through your eyes, we believe." By New Year's, Notre Dame had become a place unlike any other. The French government, trying to manage the throngs of visitors, established new safety measures. But even officials, used to chaos and crowds, admitted it was unlike anything they had ever seen. One police officer confided, "I don't even believe in God, but every night I leave here with peace in my chest." And that was the remarkable thing. Belief didn't matter. Faith didn't matter. The peace, the calm, the quiet joy that touched everyone, believer or not, was real, and it was palpable. Paris itself seemed transformed, a city carrying something larger than architecture or history, something alive. The apparition didn't just change cities or draw crowds, it changed lives in ways you could feel in your chest. Families who hadn't spoken in years found themselves hugging, crying, and laughing together again. I met a man, estranged from his brother for 20 years, who told me he finally embraced him after returning from Notre Dame. "I don't even know why I waited so long," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Something shifted inside me. Couples on the edge of divorce began speaking gently to one another, remembering the tenderness that first drew them together. I watched one woman take her husband's hand in a cafe near the Seine and say, "I forgive you," and saw the weight lift off both their shoulders. It wasn't magic in the way people expect. There was no instant solution, no sudden fix, but there was a light, a soft urging that made hearts willing to try again. And then there were the healings, the real, undeniable ones. Sister Marie-Françoise, with her restored hands, led vigils night after night. Her body, once racked with pain, moved freely now. She said she could feel the prayers of all those who came to Notre Dame. their hope and sorrow blending into a kind of energy she had never known. "I was given back my hands," she told me, "so I could serve others better." Claire, the woman who had been given only weeks to live, now glowed with vitality. Jean-Luc, her husband, couldn't stop holding her hands, tears rolling down his cheeks. "She gave you back to me," he whispered, as if the miracle were personal, as if it were a gift carved from their own lives, and in many ways it was. Every story of healing, reconciliation, or renewed hope felt like a ripple in a vast, unending current. Children, too, were touched. Thomas, the boy whose simple words had captured hearts worldwide, became a living symbol of faith and innocence restored. Journalists asked him what the Virgin had said, and he answered honestly, without any pretense. "She didn't speak with words. She spoke with her heart. She told me God loves us, even if we don't love him back, and that we should love each other the same way." Those words traveled farther than any sermon, reaching millions with their simplicity and truth. Through the stories of ordinary people, mothers, fathers, priests, nuns, children, the sick, the grieving, a pattern emerged. The apparition wasn't just a spectacle to witness, it was a call to action, a reminder that love, mercy, and hope were not abstract ideas. They were real, and they could enter lives, even the most broken ones. By now, it was clear. This wasn't a fleeting moment. The effects of the apparition rippled outward, touching Paris and beyond. Homes once heavy with silence or bitterness now echoed with conversation, forgiveness, and laughter. Churches that had been empty or indifferent now saw long lines of pilgrims waiting to kneel, light a candle, or leave a small note of prayer. And it didn't matter whether someone was a believer or not. People could feel it. They could feel a mother's love, tender and persistent, reaching into their lives and asking nothing in return. It was the kind of peace that sank into your chest and refused to leave, a quiet warmth that even the most skeptical could not deny. Paris was changing in ways I could see and feel. The city streets, once filled with the constant hum of indifference or cynicism, now buzzed with conversations about hope, love, and faith. Cafes became more than places to eat or gossip. They were spaces for reflection, for sharing stories of small miracles and personal transformations. People sat across from one another and talked openly about what had touched their hearts. Artists were inspired like never before. Painters filled canvases with depictions of the apparition, capturing the tender eyes of Mary in every brushstroke. Musicians composed hymns that weren't just for church services, but for anyone in need of a quiet moment of connection. Even theatre productions and poetry readings began to weave in themes of mercy and reconciliation. The city's creative pulse had shifted, driven by something deeper than style or trend, something spiritual. And yet, it wasn't just Paris that felt different. Across the world, churches rang their bells in unison, joining a chorus of hope that spanned continents. Manila, Mexico City, Rome, and beyond, everywhere, people lit candles, whispered prayers, and shared stories of love restored. Secular commentators tried to explain it away as nostalgia or a search for meaning in chaotic times. But those who had been touched knew better. There was no theory that could capture the depth of what had happened. Notre Dame, once scarred by fire, had become a living beacon. Pilgrims poured in from every corner of the globe, kneeling where Mary had appeared, leaving letters and drawings, lighting candles and praying. Some came seeking miracles, others came simply hoping for peace. And in countless lives, large and small, both were found. The city itself seemed to breathe differently. Streets that had felt heavy with despair now carried the hum of quiet joy. Conversations in cafes included laughter and gentle reflection instead of complaints and gossip. People who had walked past one another without notice now offered smiles, handshakes, or kind words. Even skeptics, if not converted, admitted a subtle shift within themselves. They noticed it in their hearts, in the way their chest felt lighter, in the unexpected compassion that arose when they least expected it. It was as if Paris itself had become a living testament to what could happen when love, mercy, and hope were allowed to flow freely. Notre Dame was no longer just a monument or a relic of history. It had become a lighthouse, a spiritual anchor in a fractured world, casting light not through stone or glass or even fire, but through the simple, undeniable force of a mother's love. Everywhere, people were beginning to understand that miracles were not always dramatic or loud. Sometimes they were quiet. A smile returned after decades of bitterness. A sick hand was healed. A child's simple words reminded a world lost in complexity that faith and innocence could still exist. And in each instance, the same refrain echoed, "She touched me, she healed me, she gave me peace." January 8, 2025, arrived like no other day in living memory. St. Peter's Square in Rome was overflowing with people. More than 150,000 pilgrims gathered in the cold, all of them craning their necks toward the basilica's loggia. Millions more were watching from television screens and live streams across the world. The air was electric, thick with anticipation, a fragile balance between hope and disbelief. Would the Church, so often cautious and measured, truly recognize what had shaken the world? Would they call it authentic? Or would it remain a mystery whispered in the shadows of Notre Dame? The bells of St. Peter's tolled, their sound rippling through the square and into the hearts of everyone present. And then Pope Francis appeared. He walked slowly but steadily, his aged voice carrying warmth even to those watching far from Rome. "Brothers and sisters of the world," he began, "the Church has examined with the utmost care the events that unfolded at Notre Dame de Paris on December 13th. After hearing witnesses, reviewing medical evidence, and discerning prayerfully, I can now declare that the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Notre Dame is recognized as authentic." The square erupted, bells pealed across Rome. From Manila to Mexico City, churches rang their towers in unison, celebrating a confirmation that felt both monumental and deeply personal. In Paris, the crowds outside Notre Dame fell to their knees. Many wept openly, tears streaming down faces weathered by hope and despair. For believers, it was more than validation. It was heaven itself acknowledging what they had experienced firsthand. The Pope continued, his voice calm yet resolute. "Mary came to us not to frighten, but to comfort. She came to remind us that God has not abandoned his children, even in an age of doubt. She calls us back to her Son, to love, mercy, and hope. Her message is simple: do not be afraid. I am with you." In the front pews of Notre Dame that day, Marie-Claire sat clutching her grandson Thomas's hand, her eyes closed as the announcement played over the speakers. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me see." Her heart, once burdened with grief, now pulsed with uncontainable joy. She had become a living witness, her transformation itself a testament to what had occurred. Nearby, Jean-Luc and Claire Moreau sat together, his rough hands gripping hers. Claire, once given only weeks to live, now radiated health that had baffled every doctor. Tears ran down Jean-Luc's face as he whispered, "She gave you back to me." In that moment, the work he had done on Notre Dame was no longer carpentry. It was devotion, a sacred act of gratitude. Sister Marie-Françoise, standing at the altar with hands raised, now healed and strong, looked over the sea of pilgrims. Women from across the globe had joined her nightly prayers. "I was given back my hands," she told me, "so that I might serve you better." Her story inspired countless others to see suffering not as an end point, but as a place where grace might arrive. And Thomas, the boy whose words had captured the world's attention, became a symbol of faith and innocence restored. When asked what the Virgin had told him, he said with childlike honesty, She didn't speak with words. She spoke with her heart. She told me that God loves us, even if we don't love him back, and that we should love each other the same way. Those simple words spread farther than any scholar or theologian could have. By spring, the impact of the apparition was undeniable. More than 200 documented healings had been verified. Crime rates in Paris fell, charitable donations surged, vocations to religious life increased. Even skeptics, if not fully converted, admitted something had shifted. Notre Dame itself stood restored, a living shrine, pulsing with the echoes of love and hope. As the months passed, the world began to feel the ripple effects of that 7-minute apparition. Paris, and in many ways Europe, carried a new rhythm, a sense of calm and hope threading through daily life. Families once fractured by anger or bitterness found themselves speaking again, laughing together, and discovering forgiveness they thought impossible. Cafes and parks became spaces for reflection, conversations about grace, and small acts of kindness. The story of Notre Dame inspired artists, musicians, and writers far beyond France. Galleries displayed paintings of Mary's apparition, capturing her gaze in colors that seemed almost alive. Composers created hymns and pieces meant to comfort, heal, and remind listeners of love's quiet power. Even schools began discussing the events, not just as history, but as lessons in faith, hope, and human resilience. People from all walks of life were touched. Pilgrims came seeking miracles, some left with physical healings, others with the peace that comes from feeling seen and loved. Skeptics reported subtle shifts within themselves, the urge to forgive, to listen, or to care more deeply for neighbors. It was as if a quiet force had entered the world, one that could not be contained by labels, geography, or creed. Notre Dame, restored and vibrant, became more than a monument. It became a living shrine. Pilgrims knelt where Mary had appeared, leaving letters, drawings, and candles. Some traveled across continents to find the peace they had heard about on television, while others simply came to witness, to breathe in the stillness that seemed impossible to ignore. The church formally named the apparition Our Lady of Hope at Notre Dame, a title that reflected the gift of comfort and courage it brought to countless lives. Even the secular world felt the change. Communities began taking small, unexpected steps toward kindness and reconciliation. Offices and neighborhoods organized drives to help the less fortunate. People who had abandoned spirituality began lighting candles again, if only to feel a sense of connection. Hope became tangible. It was no longer abstract. It was walking, breathing, and speaking in streets, homes, and public squares. Children like Thomas continued to inspire. His simple words, "She spoke with her heart," reminded adults that faith could be pure, untarnished by doubt or cynicism. Many began to see that miracles did not always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes they came quietly through healed hands, reconciled families, and a newfound sense of peace. By the spring of 2025, Notre Dame had become a focal point for pilgrimage from every corner of the globe. Thousands, kneeling together, sharing prayers and tears, bore witness not only to Mary's apparition, but to the larger truth it revealed: that love could pierce despair, that heaven could touch history, and that one mother's tenderness could transform countless lives. Even cities far from Paris reported subtle changes. Charitable giving increased. Crime declined in neighborhoods where despair had once dominated. Individuals recounted moments of inexplicable peace, decisions guided by mercy and reconciliations long thought impossible. In a world fractured by conflict and cynicism, the apparition had sent a shockwave of hope, quietly reshaping hearts everywhere. By mid-2025, the story of Notre Dame was no longer just about stone, glass, or fire. It had become about love breaking through despair, about heaven stepping quietly into history, and about a mother reminding her children that they were not forgotten. Pilgrims continued to pour into Paris from every continent, some kneeling where Mary had appeared, some simply walking through the restored cathedral with reverent awe. Marie Claire and her grandson Thomas remained symbols of the personal impact. She had witnessed miracles of healing and reconciliation firsthand, and Thomas, with his unshakable innocence, continued to inspire people around the world. Their stories reminded everyone that faith is not only about grand gestures. Sometimes it is the quiet, steadfast belief in love and goodness that transforms hearts. Sister Marie-Françoise's prayer community grew stronger every month. Women, both lay and religious, came from distant countries to join the nightly vigils. Her healed hands, once crippled by pain, now moved freely in prayer and service. She shared her gift generously, saying, "I was given back my hands so that I might serve you better." Her message resonated deeply. Suffering is not the end. Grace can arrive even in the darkest moments. Notre Dame became a living, breathing testament to hope. Pilgrims reported healings, reconciliations, and personal awakenings. Letters arrived daily from around the globe. Stories of renewed marriages, families reunited, people finding courage to face illness, and communities inspired to act with compassion. The cathedral's Gothic arches echoed with more than prayers. They carried the heartbeat of millions whose lives had been touched by something larger than themselves. Even those who had doubted or who considered themselves skeptics found themselves changed. They spoke of moments of unexpected peace, of feelings of warmth in their hearts, or the inexplicable urge to forgive. It was subtle, but undeniable. Something profound had swept across humanity, bridging divides and opening eyes to the possibility of love in a weary world. Churches everywhere began celebrating the apparition, naming it Our Lady of Hope at Notre Dame. Statues were commissioned, feast days proposed, prayers written. Yet beyond titles, ceremonies, and celebrations, what endured most was the memory of a gaze, tender, compassionate, and alive with a mother's love. The world had been reminded that even in moments of destruction or despair, light and hope remain. Archbishop Ulrich captured it best during a solemn mass of thanksgiving. The fire tried to destroy our cathedral, but from its ashes rose a place of miracles. And through Mary, God has shown us once again that light is stronger than darkness, hope stronger than death, and love stronger than every fear. The congregation, a sea of faces from every background, lifted together in hope. Notre Dame had become more than Paris's pride or France's treasure. It now belonged to the world. It was a lighthouse, guiding humanity back to love, mercy, and the knowledge that we are never truly abandoned. Its story was no longer an ending, but a beginning, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, heaven's light can shine through. And for those touched by the miracle, the message was simple and enduring. Believe, hope, love, and do not fear. Let that light guide your heart and share it with others. For Notre Dame had shown the world that in 7 minutes, a mother's love could change everything, and the echo of that love would last for generations.